I still remember the way my dad held his suitcase that morning. It wasn't a regular business trip bag. It was bigger, heavier, like he knew it wasn't just a week away. I was 6 years old, standing in the hallway of our tiny house in upstate New York, hugging my stuffed panda while my mom stood behind me in her waitress uniform. My dad, Daniel Cole, kissed my forehead and said, "I'll be back soon, sweetheart. I promise." He looked nervous, but determined. My mom didn't say much. She just nodded, arms crossed, eyes tired. That was 2002. He said he was going overseas for a huge opportunity, a tech startup investment that could change everything for us. We were barely making ends meet. My mom worked nights at the diner, and my dad had been trying to get his software consulting business off the ground for years. There were more bills than income, and more silence than warmth in the house. Before he left, he told me he was doing it for me. "One day, you'll understand," he said. At 6, I believed him. Weeks passed, then months. We'd get postcards from strange places, Singapore, Berlin, Dubai, with scribbled notes and smiley faces, and checks, big ones, my mom said, enough to fix the roof, pay off debts, even put a little away for my future. But my birthday came and went without a call. So did Christmas. My mom stopped saying soon when I asked when he'd be back. She'd tuck me in at night with a smile and then cry in the kitchen while doing the dishes. He'd send emails sometimes, long ones about how hard he was working, how this was the big break, how we'd all be together again soon with a better life. But something about them felt distant, like he was writing to a version of me that existed only in his mind. I still slept with the panda he gave me before he left. I still believed he'd walk through the door any day now, drop his suitcase, and pick me up like nothing had changed. But life moved on. School started, teeth fell out. My mom worked longer hours, and the hallway where we said goodbye stayed quiet. He never came back. By the time I turned 10, I stopped asking about him. My mom never said a bad word about my dad, not once. But her silence? That said everything. It hung in the air between us, at the dinner table, in the car rides, during every school play where there was always one empty seat in the front row. At first, I clung to the belief that he was just busy, that he really was doing it all for us. The checks kept coming, and when I asked if that meant he'd be back soon, my mom would force a smile and say, "He's working hard for your future, baby." That word again, future, like the present didn't matter. The house was small but quiet, too quiet, especially after Mom started taking extra shifts, early mornings and late nights. I learned how to heat up leftovers and pack my own lunch before I learned how to ride a bike. I became good at keeping myself busy. Sometimes I'd pull out the old photo albums just to remember what his voice sounded like. I wrote letters too, piles of them, pages of everything I wanted to say but didn't have an address for. I kept them in a box under my bed. The first ones were sweet. "I miss you. Guess what I did today? I got an A on my spelling test." The later ones, not so much. I didn't send them. I didn't even know where to. Eventually, the letters got shorter. Just angry scrawls, just questions he never answered. By the time middle school rolled around, my classmates had dads who showed up to basketball games and science fairs. Mine was a shadow, present in the form of money, but absent in every way that mattered. The worst part? He still sent gifts, wrapped boxes with expensive gadgets, brand-name clothes, even a violin one year. Like he remembered I once said I wanted to learn. I never opened them. Then came high school. I made the honor roll, gave speeches, got into college early. He never called, not once. And when Mom got sick, it all came crashing down. She didn't want to worry me, so she kept it quiet for a while. Stage 3 by the time I knew. I stayed with her every night in the hospital, skipped exams, took care of her hair, her hands, her spirit. She kept telling me she was proud. I just kept telling her to hold on. But she didn't make it. I sent the news to his old email. No reply. He missed her funeral. That was the last straw. At 19, I stood by her grave with a folded letter in my coat pocket, the one I'd written years ago that ended with, "Please don't let it be too late." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just folded it tighter and walked away. And for the first time in my life, I stopped waiting. 20 years is a long time to convince yourself you're doing the right thing. Daniel Cole did just that. By 2022, his face had been on magazine covers, his name floated on Forbes lists, his company praised as a tech marvel of modern times. He had the penthouse, the private jet, the interviews where he talked about hustle and sacrifice. But there were no family photos on his desk, no worn-out drawings from a child's hand taped to the fridge, no one waiting for him when he came home. He had everything he thought he wanted, and yet something felt unfinished, unsettled. It started with a photograph. He was cleaning out an old box while prepping his penthouse for some new minimalist redesign when he found it, a photo of Lena, age 5, sitting on his shoulders at a park in Albany. Her smile was lopsided, missing a front tooth. His hands gripped her legs. You could see her trust in him, her joy. He hadn't looked at that photo in years, maybe decades. And in that moment, everything around him, his empire, his accolades, his calendar full of board meetings and gala invites, went completely silent. He stared at the photo until the sun went down. That night, he tried to look her up, her full name, her old school, her LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook. It wasn't hard. She had her mother's last name now. She was 26. A writer, it looked like. Something with non-profits. Living in the city, not too far from where he had once promised to come back. Daniel sent her a message. Simple, honest. "Lena, I know I have no right to ask, but I'd like to talk. I think about you every day. Please let me know if you'd be open to seeing me." He waited. No response. He sent another. Then a handwritten letter to the address he believed was hers. No reply. No acknowledgement. Not even a returned envelope. Daniel wasn't used to being ignored. CEOs called him back in 5 minutes. Billionaires asked for his advice. Presidents had once invited him to speak. But his own daughter? Nothing. The silence felt heavier than any business loss he'd ever taken. And so, in a decision that made his assistant raise an eyebrow, Daniel canceled his next public appearance, rescheduled board meetings, and booked a quiet flight out of L.A. He was going to see her, in person. It had been 2 decades, and he had no idea what he'd say when he got there. He didn't tell anyone he was going. No assistant, no board, no driver. Just Daniel Cole in a black coat, standing on the street corner outside a non-profit literacy center in Brooklyn, holding a paper coffee cup that had gone cold 2 hours ago. He'd Googled her name 100 times before confirming it. Lena Marie Caldwell, program director. He even watched a few videos of her giving speeches. Her voice sounded like her mother's. He waited until her shift was almost over. And then she walked out. He nearly didn't recognize her. The last real image in his mind was a 6-year-old with braided pigtails and a pink backpack. But this woman, confident, composed, purposeful, was her, no doubt. He called her name. Lena. She stopped, looked around. Her eyes scanned the street, confused at first. Then she saw him. And in that moment, Daniel felt every single year hit him like a wave. His age, his absence, the weight of 2 decades. He tried to smile. "It's me. Her expression didn't soften. It didn't break. It hardened. "You don't get to just show up," she said flatly. The sidewalk was busy, cars honking, people walking around them like it was any other Tuesday. But for Daniel, time stopped. He opened his mouth, tried to speak, to explain, to say anything that might slow her retreat. But she was already walking away. He took a step after her. "Lena, please, just a minute, just one." She didn't even look back. Later that night, he stood outside the apartment building her name was listed under. He didn't knock. He didn't ring the buzzer. He just stared up at the windows, wondering which one was hers. The next morning, he went back, and the next, always from a distance. Eventually, he began slipping letters under her door. Some were short. "Please talk to me." Some were long. Pages of memories, regrets, things he'd never said. One letter was different. He titled it "My Apology." It was the hardest one to write. In it, he admitted he had been a coward. That ambition had swallowed his soul, and he'd convinced himself that providing money could ever replace presence. That watching her grow up through second-hand stories and social media posts was a shame he carried every day. He left that one on a rainy Friday morning, sealed in a pale blue envelope with nothing else on it. But her name? He didn't expect an answer, but he checked his phone every hour anyway. Weeks passed. The pale blue envelope sat on Lena's desk, unopened. She hadn't even touched it after sliding it off the floor, just placed it beside her laptop like a piece of clutter she couldn't decide whether to throw away or shred. Sometimes she'd glance at it while drinking her morning coffee. Other times she'd deliberately avoid looking at that corner of the room altogether. But it was always there, a quiet weight in the silence of her apartment. She told herself she didn't care what it said, that nothing written inside could undo 20 years of absence. Nothing could change the nights she cried herself to sleep as a kid. Nothing could erase the way her mother slowly withered in a hospital bed, whispering, "Maybe he'll come," with a kind of hope that made Lena angrier than she'd ever admit. But she couldn't bring herself to throw the letter away either. Then one night, long after midnight, Lena sat on the couch in her pajamas and stared at the envelope like it had insulted her. She sighed, said "screw it" out loud to nobody, and opened it. The first thing she noticed was the handwriting. Careful, not rushed. The paper was thick, probably expensive. Of course it was. But the words, they weren't polished. They were messy, honest, hesitant. "I've rewritten this too many times, and I'm probably still getting it wrong, but I owe you more than silence." He wrote about the moment he left, how he thought 1 year would be enough, then 2, then 5. How success had a way of blinding you to the things you think you can fix later. He wrote that every check he sent was his guilt dressed as generosity, that he kept waiting for the right time to come back. And by the time he realized there wouldn't be one, too much damage had been done. "You don't know me, not anymore, and I don't deserve to ask for anything. But I miss the little girl who called me Daddy, and I hate the man who walked away from her." At the end, he wrote something that made her hands stop shaking. "I'm stepping down from everything, selling the company. I don't need it. I don't want it. If there's any part of you that's open to knowing me now, not the man who left, but the one who finally understands why that was unforgivable, I'll be here for as long as it takes." He also left a legal document, his will. It transferred everything to her, his properties, his accounts, his legacy. She folded the letter back neatly, slid it into a new envelope, wrote a note on a sticky pad, and mailed it back. He received it 2 days later. The letter was unopened. The note on top read, "Too late. I needed a father, not a check." He had one card left to play. Daniel didn't expect forgiveness, not anymore. But he couldn't let it end with a sealed envelope and 4 words that cut deeper than anything he'd ever read. "Too late. I needed a father, not a check." He carried those words in his chest like a stone. Days passed, but he couldn't breathe right, not when there was still something left unsaid, something she deserved to hear, from him, not from a letter. So he wrote one more note, short, simple. "If you're willing, I'll be at Cafe Alder on the 12th this Friday at 5 p.m. I won't contact you again after this. No speeches, just truth. Yours to decide." He didn't expect her to come, but he went anyway. He wore no suit this time, just jeans and an old sweater that didn't quite fit anymore. He sat at a corner table facing the door, nursing a black coffee for nearly an hour. He checked his watch every few minutes, looked up every time the bell over the door rang, blinked too often. It was nearly 6 o'clock when she walked in. Same calm presence, same guarded posture. She saw him, didn't smile, didn't sit, just stood there a few feet away, arms crossed. "I'm not here to talk," she said. "You wanted to be heard, so go ahead." Daniel stood, but didn't move closer. His voice was low. "I could say I'm sorry, but I think you've heard enough of that." She didn't respond. He continued, quieter now. "I missed everything, not because I didn't care, because I was too much of a coward to admit I made the wrong choice early and kept running from it." Still nothing from her, just a steady gaze that held him like a mirror. "I thought money could fix it, that one day I'd show up with enough to prove I hadn't failed. But I did. I failed you." Silence stretched between them. Then Lena finally spoke. "You don't apologize when it's convenient. You show up when it matters. You didn't." He flinched but nodded. He deserved that, every word. "I'm not here to ask for anything," he said. "Not even a second chance. I just needed to say it to your face, that I was wrong, that I let you down in every way that matters." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked away. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. She just turned and walked out the door. Daniel didn't follow. He just stood there, alone again. Only this time he knew there would be no more letters, no more visits, no more hope. That was the last chapter of their story, or so he thought. The penthouse was gone. So were the meetings, the media, the headlines. Daniel Cole disappeared from the business world like a whisper. No press release, no statement, just silence. The properties were sold off quietly, the shares transferred, every cent of his wealth redirected into anonymous foundations, funds for single mothers, education grants for fatherless kids, shelters, clinics, scholarships with no name attached. He didn't want credit. He didn't want forgiveness. He just wanted to put something better into the world than what he took out of it. Now he lived in a small, weather-beaten cottage by the sea, a narrow porch, a wooden chair that creaked in the wind, mornings with coffee and gulls, evenings with a pen and blank paper. He wrote every day. not to Lena, just about her. He kept her photo, the same one that changed everything, tucked in a drawer with his passport and the last unopened stock certificate he never bothered to cash. The mailbox was usually empty, until one day it wasn't. It was a simple envelope, no return address. The handwriting was young, slanted. On the back, one sentence: "My mom never talks about you." He opened it slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten, just a few lines. "Heard you were my grandpa. I'm 8. My name's Ellie. I like drawing, and my mom makes the best pancakes in the world. Just wanted to know why she never talks about you." Daniel sat on the porch for a long time, the letter resting in his lap, the ocean moving like breath beyond the rail. He reached for his pen and began to write. One last letter. No business, no excuses, just a name, Ellie, and a story he'd never told before, one he should have started long, long ago.